Imagine having to plan the most important battle of your life without the tools we take for granted today. No satellite imagery, no digital maps, no drones scanning the landscape from above. Not even a reliable paper map. Just your eyes, your instincts, and your ability to read the land in front of you. Every hill, every patch of grass, every narrow path through a valley might decide whether your army survives or disappears from history. For most commanders, that kind of uncertainty would be terrifying. But in the year 1260, one leader understood that the land itself could become his greatest weapon. At that moment in history, the armies of the Mongol Empire were the most feared military force on Earth. For nearly 50 years they had swept across continents like a storm, conquering kingdoms from East Asia to the heart of Europe. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Entire civilizations collapsed in their path. When the Mongols captured Baghdad in 1258, one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the medieval world was wiped out in a matter of days. To many people living at the time, the Mongols seemed unstoppable, an empire that simply could not lose. And yet, history sometimes turns on something surprisingly simple. Not a larger army, not a revolutionary weapon, but a piece of terrain that one side understands better than the other. In a quiet valley known as Ain Jalut, a commander saw an opportunity hidden in the landscape itself. What looked like perfect ground for Mongol cavalry would soon become the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In that valley, the myth of Mongol invincibility would finally be broken. To understand why the coming battle mattered so much, you have to step back and look at the world as it appeared in the mid-13th century. In 1258, the armies of the Mongol Empire delivered one of the most devastating blows in medieval history, the destruction of Baghdad. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the intellectual heart of the Islamic world, home to scholars, libraries, and the legendary centers of learning that preserved knowledge from Greece, Persia, and India. When the Mongols arrived, that world collapsed in a matter of days. Contemporary accounts describe libraries thrown into the Tigris River, the water turning dark with ink before it ran red with blood. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and the once powerful Abbasid Caliphate effectively vanished from the map. News of Baghdad's fall spread like wildfire across the Middle East. Cities that had stood for centuries suddenly realized that their walls, armies, and traditions meant very little against the Mongol war machine. One by one, major centers in Syria fell. Aleppo burned. Damascus surrendered. Each victory pushed the Mongol frontier closer to the next major target, Egypt. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the powerful Mamluk Sultanate, a military state built on disciplined cavalry and hardened professional soldiers. But even the Mamluks understood the scale of the threat approaching them. The Mongol commander in the region, Kitbuka, sent envoys to Cairo carrying a message that was less diplomacy and more intimidation. It was essentially an ultimatum: surrender peacefully and accept Mongol rule, or suffer the same fate that had destroyed Baghdad. For most rulers facing that choice, the calculation was brutally simple. Resistance meant almost certain destruction. Submission, while humiliating, at least offered the possibility of survival. But the Sultan of Egypt, Saif ad-Din Qus, chose a different path, one that stunned both his allies and his enemies. Instead of negotiating, Qutuz ordered the Mongol envoys executed. Their heads were displayed publicly at the gates of Cairo, a message every bit as blunt as the Mongols' original threat. Egypt would not submit. Egypt would fight. It was an act of open defiance against the most feared empire on earth. And by making that decision, Qutuz set the stage for a confrontation that would soon unfold far from Cairo, in a quiet valley that neither side yet realized would become one of the most important battlefields in history. To understand the decision that lay ahead, you have to understand the enemy the Mamluks were facing. By the middle of the 13th century, the armies of the Mongol Empire had developed a reputation unlike any military force before them. They weren't just strong. They weren't just disciplined. They were frighteningly effective at war on a scale the medieval world had never seen. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen before them, often in campaigns that seemed almost effortless. To the people watching these events unfold, it began to feel as though the Mongols were simply unbeatable. Part of that reputation came from the way Mongol soldiers fought. From childhood, they were trained on horseback, learning to ride, hunt, and shoot with a bow at full gallop. Their mobility was extraordinary. A Mongol army could travel astonishing distances in a matter of days, appearing where enemies least expected them. Their composite bows were powerful, accurate, and deadly at range, allowing them to strike opponents long before those opponents could respond. Just as important, Mongol commanders mastered coordinated maneuvers that turned speed into a weapon, rapid flanking movements, feigned retreats, and sudden encirclements that shattered larger armies. But their real strength went even deeper than tactics. The Mongols were remarkably adaptable. Wherever they went, they studied their enemies and learned from them. In northern China, they adopted advanced siege technologies to break through fortified cities. In Persia, they adjusted to urban warfare and complex terrain. When they pushed into Eastern Europe, they faced heavily armored knights and unfamiliar forests, yet they still found ways to defeat them. Again and again, they demonstrated an ability that many medieval armies lacked. They evolved. This adaptability created a problem for anyone who tried to resist them. Most traditional armies relied on familiar methods, static defenses, heavy cavalry charges, or rigid battle formations that had worked for generations. Against the Mongols, those approaches repeatedly failed. A fortress might delay them, but their engineers would eventually tear it down. A cavalry charge might look impressive, but Mongol horse archers could outmaneuver and exhaust their opponents before closing in for the kill. Time after time, rulers across Asia and Europe discovered the same harsh reality. Fighting the Mongols on their terms almost always ended in disaster. Their system of warfare had been refined across thousands of miles of conquest and decades of experience. By the time they reached the Middle East, they were arguably the most effective fighting force the world had ever seen. Which raised an almost impossible question. If you couldn't beat the Mongols by fighting the way they fought, how could you defeat them at all? At first glance, the army that would challenge the Mongols seemed like an unlikely force to change the course of history. They were known as the Mamluk Sultanate, and their soldiers were called Mamluks, a word that literally meant owned in Arabic. By origin, they were slave soldiers. Many had been taken as boys from the steppes of Central Asia or the rugged regions of the Caucasus, transported far from their homelands, converted to Islam, and placed into one of the most demanding military training systems of the medieval world. To modern ears, the idea sounds contradictory. Why would an army built from slaves be reliable in battle? But the Mamluk system was very different from what most people imagine when they hear the word slave. These young recruits were not treated as disposable labor. They were trained from childhood to become professional warriors. Years of relentless practice shaped them into elite cavalrymen skilled with sword, lance, and bow. They learned discipline, tactics, and loyalty to their fellow soldiers in a tightly bonded military brotherhood. In many ways, the Mamluks resembled a warrior academy more than a conventional army. Their training created a shared identity that often proved stronger than the feudal loyalties common in other medieval forces. Promotions were based on ability and battlefield performance rather than noble birth. Some Mamluks eventually rose to command entire armies, and a few, like the future Sultan Baybars, would go on to shape the political destiny of Egypt and the wider region. There was another important factor that made the Mamluks uniquely suited to face the Mongols. Many of them came from the same broad steppe cultures that had produced the Mongol warriors themselves. They understood how steppe cavalry fought because they had grown up in similar environments. They were familiar with the rhythms of mounted warfare, the importance of mobility, and the psychological tactics that Mongol commanders used so effectively. In other words, the Mamluks were not an army of inexperienced defenders trying to figure out Mongol tactics for the first time. They were professional horsemen who understood the mindset of steppe warfare from the inside. They knew how Mongol cavalry maneuvered, how feigned retreats worked, and how quickly a pursuit could turn into disaster if a commander misjudged the terrain. That knowledge would soon prove invaluable, because defeating the Mongols was never going to be about brute strength alone. It would require an army that could think the way the Mongols thought, while also finding the one weakness the Mongols did not expect. By the summer of 1260, the confrontation between the Mamluks and the Mongols was no longer a question of if, but where. The Mongol army advancing through Syria expected the same pattern that had worked across much of the known world: find the enemy, force them into open battle, and destroy them with superior mobility and discipline. But the Mamluk leadership understood something crucial. If they fought the Mongols on ground that favored steppe cavalry, the outcome would likely be the same as it had been for countless other armies. The only chance of victory was to choose the battlefield carefully and shape the fight before it even began. The location they selected was a place called Ain Jalut, a valley situated along the natural invasion route between Syria and Egypt. To an approaching army, the valley would appear deceptively ideal for cavalry warfare. Its floor was relatively open, a wide stretch of grassland that looked perfect for fast-moving horsemen and sweeping maneuvers. For Mongol commanders, terrain like this usually meant opportunity. But the real character of the valley was more complex. Ain Jalut was surrounded by hills covered in thick vegetation, dense enough to conceal large numbers of troops from anyone riding across the valley floor. The terrain formed a kind of natural bowl. Once an army pushed deep inside it, retreating quickly could become difficult, especially if enemy forces suddenly appeared on the surrounding slopes. This geographical detail was exactly what the Mamluk leadership intended to exploit. The plan was both simple in concept and extremely risky in execution. Most of the Mamluk army would remain hidden among the hills surrounding the valley, concealed by trees and elevation. Only a small visible force would appear on the valley floor, just enough to attract the attention of the approaching Mongols. That visible force would be commanded by one of the most capable cavalry leaders of the era, Baybars. His role was to act as bait. When the Mongols arrived, Baybars would engage them in a real fight, enough to convince the enemy that they had encountered the main Mamluk army. Then, at the right moment, he would order a retreat deeper into the valley. To the Mongols, this would look familiar. Throughout their conquests, they had seen enemy forces break and flee countless times. Pursuing a retreating opponent was practically instinct. The expectation was that the Mongol cavalry would surge forward, spreading out as they chased what appeared to be a defeated enemy. And that was precisely the moment the Mamluks were waiting for. Once the Mongol army had fully entered the valley and lost its tight formation in pursuit, the hidden forces in the hills would charge down simultaneously. What began as a Mongol pursuit would suddenly become a carefully prepared ambush, turning one of the Mongols' greatest strengths into their most dangerous vulnerability. On September 3, 1260, the moment both sides had been preparing for finally arrived. The Mongol army, led by the experienced commander Kitbuka, advanced toward the valley of Ain Jalut. From their perspective, the situation looked promising. Scouts reported a Mamluk force positioned in the valley ahead, apparently ready to block the Mongol advance south toward Egypt. For Kitbuka, this was exactly the kind of encounter Mongol commanders preferred, an enemy army exposed in open terrain where cavalry tactics could dominate. When the two forces first clashed, the fighting was intense and genuine. The forward Mamluk force, commanded by Baybars, did not simply run at the first sign of danger. His cavalry engaged the Mongols directly, arrows cutting through the air as mounted warriors collided in fast-moving skirmishes. Horses maneuvered rapidly across the valley floor while both sides tested each other's strength. To the Mongols, it looked like the beginning of a normal battle. Then, at the precise moment the plan required, Baybars gave the order to withdraw. His forces began pulling back deeper into the valley. To an outside observer, it appeared that the Mamluks had realized they were outmatched and were now retreating to save what remained of their army. For the Mongols, this scene was familiar. Across decades of conquest, they had watched enemy formations crumble in exactly the same way. Once an opponent began to retreat, Mongol doctrine was clear: pursue relentlessly and destroy them before they could regroup. Kitbuka ordered his cavalry forward. As the Mongol riders surged into the valley, their formations naturally spread out. Pursuing a retreating enemy required speed and flexibility, and individual units fanned out to chase fleeing opponents. Within minutes, the once organized Mongol force had transformed into smaller groups racing across the valley floor. That was the moment the trap closed. From the hills surrounding the valley, hidden Mamluk cavalry suddenly appeared. Thousands of riders charged downhill at full speed, striking the Mongols from both flanks at once. At nearly the same moment, Baybars halted his retreat and turned his forces around, attacking from the front. What had begun as a Mongol pursuit instantly turned into a three-sided assault. The Mongols were caught completely off balance. Their units were scattered, their formations broken, and their mobility, normally their greatest strength, suddenly meant little in the chaos of close combat. Instead of maneuvering freely across open ground, they were forced into a brutal melee where survival depended on discipline and individual fighting skill. The battle raged for hours. Kitbuka attempted to rally his soldiers repeatedly, personally leading charges to break through the tightening Mamluk lines. But the strategic situation had already turned against him. Surrounded and unable to regroup, the Mongol army began to collapse. By late afternoon, their resistance was breaking apart. Units attempted to flee the valley, but the Mamluks pressed the attack relentlessly. Thousands of Mongol warriors fell in the battle or during the pursuit that followed. Kitbuka himself was eventually captured and brought before the Mamluk leadership. True to his reputation as a hardened commander, he reportedly refused to beg for mercy. Soon afterward, he was executed, marking the final, symbolic end of the Mongol army that had marched confidently into Ain Jalut that morning. The aftermath of the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 was immediate and unmistakable. For the first time in decades, the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Mongol Empire had been decisively halted on the battlefield. The Mongol army that marched into the valley under the command of Kitbuka did not return as conquerors. Instead, it collapsed under pressure from a carefully executed counterattack led by the forces of the Mamluk Sultanate. Kitbuka himself was captured and executed, a symbolic moment that sent shockwaves across the region. But the significance of Ain Jalut went far beyond a single military victory. For nearly half a century, Mongol armies had shattered kingdoms across Asia and Eastern Europe. Cities that resisted them were often destroyed, and entire civilizations had fallen before their momentum. Many believed that nothing could stop them. Yet in the hills and valleys of northern Palestine, that belief was broken. The victory preserved the political and cultural heart of the Islamic world at a critical moment. Major centers such as Cairo, Damascus, and the broader Middle East remained outside Mongol control. Had the Mongols broken through the Mamluk defenses, the map of the region, and possibly the trajectory of global history, might have looked very different. Instead, the Mamluks proved that the Mongol war machine, for all its speed and ferocity, was not invincible. Strategically, Ain Jalut offers a lesson that still resonates today. The Mamluks did not win through brute force alone. Leaders like Baybars studied their enemy, chose the battlefield carefully, and turned the Mongols' greatest strengths, speed and aggressive pursuit, into vulnerabilities. It was a victory built on intelligence, patience, and disciplined execution. History often remembers empires for their conquests, but sometimes the moments that matter most are when expansion finally meets its limits. Ain Jalut was one of those moments. If you enjoy exploring the strategies, turning points, and hidden lessons behind history's greatest battles, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories where warfare, leadership, and strategy collide in ways that still shape our world today.